for a police officer, the greatest moment of truth is very frightening, and that is when you're about to go through a door or a window knowing that a violent offender is on the other side and armed. He'd gone click, 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 tried to shoot them. He had tried to shoot the raiding party. When asked by detectives, quite horrified detectives, if he had tried to fire on police, Collins retorted, "I didn't know it was you." I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. We've seen and heard a lot about police raids in recent weeks, obviously because of the raid that went so tragically wrong when police were attempting to arrest Desi Freeman, real name Desmond Philby. We don't need to go through that all again, but of course 10 officers turned up to serve a warrant on this man, and half an hour later 2 of them were dead and 1 was badly wounded. And as we record this podcast weeks later, Desi Freeman is either dead by his own hand or he's still out there somewhere, but he has not been found, which is a pity. But the Freeman case brings to the front of mind that for a police officer, the greatest moment of truth is very frightening, and that is when you're about to go through a door or a window knowing that a violent offender is on the other side and armed and might well shoot you. In that split second that a police officer goes through a door or a window, the greatest advantage is surprise, which is why dawn raids are exactly that. They're done shortly before sunrise when most targets are asleep or groggy, although I'll point out that clever people like Mad Dog Cox, Russell Cox, the escapee and bank robber extraordinaire, he would go jogging. He was a very fit man. He would go jogging before dawn each day, wearing not many clothes, but always wearing, I think, a little bum bag with a pistol in it. And it meant that he was out of the house at exactly the time that police raids would be done, working on the theory that if he did it often enough, one day he would be not lying in bed when the police came through the door. Very disciplined man. The other protection for police is the uniform, which is why when they do these raids, they identify themselves loudly and repeatedly, and they wear vests which are clearly marked police. Now, good crooks, which is what cops call professional crims who act rationally, tend not to make arrest a heap worse by shooting at police, which can have deadly repercussions because, of course, police will probably shoot back and they probably won't miss. But good crooks are very different from lethal lunatics, and we have the perfect example in one pair of escapees back in the 90s. That was the difference between the notorious escaper Peter Gibb, who was an armed robber, and his fellow fugitive Archie Butterley. These were the jailmates who headed for the bush after breaking out of the Melbourne remand prison in 1993, helped by Peter Gibb's prison officer lover, an unfortunate and misguided woman called Heather Parker. Butterley, apart from being Scottish, had an insanely mean streak. He hated police and made the deadly mistake of taking a shot at one from a hiding spot when the 3 fugitives were cornered by the SOG and dog handlers 5 days into their Bonnie and 2 Clydes escapade. Butterley was found shot in the head with a stolen police pistol, which was found beside him. A death that a coroner later hesitated to label as suicide. But if he didn't shoot himself, and he might have, who did? Well, maybe it was Gibb, who possibly shot his volatile companion to prevent a siege he knew was unsurvivable. Gibb, unlike Butterley, was a good crook, an armed robber who played the percentages. Once, when police raided his bedroom before dawn, pointing guns at him in bed, he stayed absolutely calm. "What's going on, boys?" he said, deadpan, keeping his hands in plain sight. No sudden movements. Smart crooks with underworld enemies would much rather be raided by disciplined SOG members, or even undisciplined detectives, than by rival toe cutters out to torture them for money or drugs. But the possibility that targets can briefly mistake police for underworld enemies means that a few terrifying seconds can be the line between life and death. Prolific hitman Rodney Collins, now we've talked about him a lot, was a cruel killer with many enemies. When the Special Operations Group, the SOG, raided him in Broadmeadows in the 1980s, they were delayed a few seconds by plastic coating on the windows. That delay could have been fatal. When they got inside, Collins seemed docile, but police detectives, this was later, found a loaded revolver thrown under a bed. This is, later that day or next day or something. Every bullet in this revolver had been dented by a faulty firing pin. Clearly, he'd gone click, 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 tried to shoot them. He had tried to shoot the raiding party. When asked by detectives, quite horrified detectives, if he had tried to fire on police, Collins retorted, "I didn't know it was you." Last year, a man was shot dead by a Donnybrook householder while committing a home invasion. Quote, "If they think it's a criminal run-through, they'll shoot," one policeman told my colleague Mark Butler. And guns are not the only risk. Ice-fueled knife wielders are a huge threat to anybody who comes near them. Police who raided an inner-city Housing Commission apartment several years ago found the suspect in bed with his hands behind his head. After dragging him out of the blankets, they then found a loaded pistol under his pillow. A few seconds slower, and it could have ended very badly. One former officer, a veteran of dozens of high-risk raids on armed offenders, recalls hiding only metres from armed robbers as they got out of a vehicle in boiler suits, wearing balaclavas and tucking sawn-off firearms under their clothes. Asked about this later, he said 2 words: nervous energy. That's what it feels like. It's the ultimate pointy end, he went on. You're going in against someone who's got a gun and there's a good chance they'll have a crack at you. The problem is that not everyone is a good crook, prepared to drop weapons and go quietly. Some are desperate or unhinged by drugs. Then there are deranged backyard terrorists like the fugitive pensioner we mentioned earlier, Desmond Christopher Philby, alias Desi Freeman, who renamed himself on the downward spiral that allegedly led him to kill the 2 police at Purapunka weeks ago. The fear factor is highest when the offender is not only armed but dangerously unstable. Even more so if he has already killed and has little to lose by killing again. Now, I use the pronoun he here because almost invariably the people that do this sort of crazy stuff are blokes, males, or identify as males. Anyone who says they don't have some trepidation isn't being honest with themselves, says former armed robbery squad boss Ray Watson, who has spoken to us in this studio a couple of times. Ray Watson was involved in dozens of raids during the golden age of armed robbery. Now we're talking about the 70s and 80s. He doesn't get any argument from another former detective, Joe Noonan, who took part in the 100-plus raids on known underworld haunts after the 1988 murders of 2 young constables in Walsh Street, South Yarra. That, of course, is the Tynan Eyre murders, the 2 young police that were shot dead in cold blood. Noonan has forgotten details of most of those raids, but not the death of a fellow police officer in a bungled job he was called to. Early in 1987, Noonan and another detective rushed to the scene of a police shooting in Fawkner to find that a policewoman had shot at an armed man just as her brave colleague jumped into the line of fire to tackle the offender. That brave policeman, Neil Clinch, he's a footballer, good sportsman, thought he could avoid a gunfight by launching himself at the crook and taking him to the ground. Sadly, he didn't signal his intentions to his fellow officer, and she shot at the bad guy just as Neil Clinch launched himself at him, and the police bullets hit the policeman. Clinch was shot in the head and he died of his injuries hours later. That tragic death underlined the high risk of friendly fire in police raids and sieges. The young Joe Noonan turned up that day. He cradled the young Clinch as he slipped away. He said to me later, "I looked into his eyes and I'd like to think he could hear me and know that he wasn't alone." Underneath the hard-bitten cop humour, Noonan reckons he was never quite the same after that. But the circumstances of another death, when an offender was justifiably shot dead, also sticks in his mind. That was when he was kitted up with a ballistic vest and shotgun to be first in on the raid on one of the Walsh Street cop killers and was told to stand down at the last minute. A late decision was made to swing in the Special Operations Group to do the raid, which was on the Walsh Street triggerman, Jed Horton. Horton and his then-girlfriend were hiding out in a rented cabin at a Bendigo caravan park. Horton had fitted an iron bar across the glass sliding door to reinforce it, and he was known to have multiple guns. This was a chilling scenario for whoever had to go in first. Those very frightening words, go in first. Right up until the plans changed at the last minute, that person was to be Joe Noonan. He'd been seconded from the Major Crime Squad to a homicide task force after the Walsh Street outrage. Noonan prefers not to dwell on what might have happened if the SOG hadn't finally sent its highly trained, well-armed siege specialists, whose teamwork was synchronised by relentless drills. Quote, "It took the SOG a few seconds to get through the door, but it would have taken me a lot longer," Noonan says, musing on the likely outcome if the SOG hadn't flown to Bendigo that day. Obviously what he's thinking is the guy, Jed Horton, who was inside, he'd already shot, if not one, then two police, dead. He was desperate, he was mad and bad, and he had multiple guns. So if one didn't work, another one would. He had several. I think there was something like half a dozen guns found in the cabin afterwards.
Hi, it's Gary Jubilant here. Do you want a real and raw look inside the world of crime? Well then check out my podcast, I Catch Killers, where I interview people from all sides of the law.
I draw my firearm and I went into fight mode. I wanted to find and confront this gunman.
I'm not getting verbal, am I?
I shouldn't have trusted you. See, I'm trying to open my mind up to defence barriers.
I know, it's just begging to be said.
Yeah, fair call, fair call. We have amazing guests every week. Search for I Catch Killers wherever you get your podcasts.
There is an obvious parallel between that scene and what happened at Porapunka when veteran detective Neil Thompson opened a window in a stationary bus occupied by Freeman, only to be felled with a shotgun blast at point-blank range, a second before his fellow officer Vadim Devort Hotart was also shot dead. Sudden death or catastrophic injury is the faint but ever-present possibility hanging over ordinary police working on the road. Every time officers approach a door or even a car, there's that chance that they won't come home safely. That lingering sense of threat began, many say, when a man every bit as crazed as Freeman started shooting Victorian police back in 1985. I clearly remember this. That, of course, was Pavel Marinov, the Bulgarian army deserter, a loner who had taught himself to be a deadly pistol shot. He was much like another human hyena, Bandali Debs, who also honed his pistol shooting and armed robberies right up until shooting policemen Gary Silk and Rod Miller in 1998. Marinov was dubbed Mad Max. He shot and wounded several police and was on the run for 8 months before being shot dead by 2 detectives using the same deadly SG buckshot as Freeman allegedly used last month. Marinov managed to wound both detectives in the split second before he was killed. It was Marinov's carnage in 1985 that rattled police and popularised the muttered but well-known motto, "Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. The subsequent rash of police shootings, of offenders eventually led to a backlash, with a less confrontational approach eventually being imposed on the troops by police command. But along with that new doctrine of cordon and contain, that means to wait out potential shooters in seizures rather than mount gun battles, was the rise of the SOG, otherwise known as the Soggies or the Sons of God. The SOG, founded in the 1970s through the foresight of the very canny Chief Commissioner Mick Miller, matured by the 1990s from its gung-ho military origins into a specialist service that operated with surgical efficiency. SOG members trained much like the Armed Forces elite SAS and commando units, but whereas commandos trained to kill enemies efficiently far from public sight, the Soggies must do something equally difficult. They have to resolve deadly situations in the places we live without harming anyone except when absolutely necessary. The SOG has become so good at its dangerous work that general street police are now arguably more at risk on the job than SOG members are. Statistically, the ordinary copper driving around on the beat in a busy suburb probably got more chance of being hurt than the SOG guys, because the SOG guys are very good at hurting other people and not being hurt themselves. They go prepared. It'll take a coroner's court and an internal inquisition by police command to gauge what went wrong at Porepunkah on the last Tuesday of winter. But one principle might have been drafted in blood at Desi Freeman's lair. If a troublesome citizen with known anti-authority views is wanted for firearms offences, he should be picked up in a neutral public area, perhaps, a time and place when he's clearly unarmed. If approached on his home ground, it should be done, perhaps, by the proven professionals in the SOG. Of course, hindsight is 20/20. We all know that, and it's very easy to sit back and criticise or comment on things later, and it's not always helpful. But a couple of things might be said by some critics. They might say that a loose and effectively leaderless bunch of 10 random police gathered to arrest a troublesome target is not quite one thing or the other. It's an imitation of force rather than the real thing. Life and Crimes consulted George Haitley, who was an early member of the SOG and then, interestingly, a key instructor in honing the group's skills. And he sees it a bit that way too. Haitley hasn't been in the police force for some years now, but he's still heavily linked to security work in the sense that he supplies and demonstrates and sells the sort of gear that is used by security forces and police forces around the world. He's certainly an expert. Haitley recalls how full of adrenaline he was before his first SOG raid back in 1986. He said, "I couldn't even listen or concentrate in the briefing." But by the end of his 8 years in the SOG, he'd become so relaxed before raids that it almost bored him. That was the difference in 8 years. He'd done so many, and they'd got so good at it that it was just like going to the corner shop. He stresses the need for reconnaissance and for training until life-preserving reactions become automatic under pressure. Now, this is the sort of training and effort that ordinary coppers on the beat haven't got time to do, to be brutally fair. One of Haitley's contemporaries, a detective who later studied psychology, learned about raids by doing them and watching others do them. He says 2 rules of human behaviour apply. One is that action nearly always beats reaction. The other is that in the face of extreme danger, humans opt for fight or flight, or freeze. At Porepunkah, he says the offender's action in the face of perceived threat was to fight and then to run away, fight followed by flight. As for the police, faced with the massive shock of seeing 2 of their colleagues shot dead and another wounded, the remaining 7 correctly obeyed standing orders to stand down until backup arrived. As one officer pointed out later, the shooter got a 3-hour start, but that was because of the rules. They had to stand down for that amount of time and wait for the SOG to arrive. And that's what happened. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.